pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. 1959 to 1975, and we always called him Colonel Marsh, or that's what he was known around town as. And I think he was a colonel in the regular army, lieutenant colonel, and served in World War II and Korea. Got caught there, I guess. So it's a privilege to have Ken with us, and I'll let him introduce his program and do whatever he wants to. But welcome, Ken Marsh.
Thank you, Alec. My subject today is Kingsport, how it came to be. And this is from about 1855 to 1925, before anybody here was born, of course. This is real history. And I want to make this statement to start with. You know, you hear a lot in politics and newspaper about vetting candidates and vet this and vet that. Well, I went and looked up the definition of vet. And the vet definition is to evaluate for appraisal or acceptance. So what I have to say here today, you can evaluate for appraisal or acceptance. Hopefully, when I'm finished, I will have touched on all these subjects up here. And if I haven't and somebody knows I missed one, let me know. There's a country and western song, the name escapes me now, but there's a line in it that says that she got the gold mine and I got the shaft.
Right.
Okay. That happened in 1855 to Kingsport, because the railroad was being built from Chattanooga to Bristol and from Lynchburg to Bristol from the other direction. And Jonesboro was hot to get the railroad. So they said to Kingsport, we'll help you dredge the river, and you can use steamboats at Kingsport, and we'll have the railroad. So that's what happened. Okay? The railroad was completed in 1859 to Bristol, and Kingsport disappeared as a community, and disappeared for about 50 years. But the war of Yankee aggression brought people into the South that didn't know anything about the South. One of those people was a fellow named John H. Wilder. Wilder was from Greencastle, Indiana, and he was a metal expert. And he joined the Union Army and fought basically across the battles in Tennessee, particularly at Chattanooga, and then was with Sherman through Atlanta to Savannah and back up to South Carolina. But one of the things that happened when he came down through this country is he found out what a rich mineral area it was, with iron ore, with coal, with limestone, all the things that he knew about. So after the war, he came back to East Tennessee, and he was the father of the metal business in Chattanooga, which has kind of disappeared now, but was a major factor in Chattanooga. He also dealt with the Roan Furnace Company at Rockwood, Tennessee. He at one time owned the top of Roan Mountain and the hotel up there. But he realized that this area needed a railroad to make the coal in Virginia, Kentucky, and West Virginia valuable. Coal is just there until you've got good transportation to move it. So he engineered the formation of a company in 1886 called the Three C's, the Charleston, Cincinnati, and Chicago Railway, to build a railroad from Charleston across East Tennessee, Southwest Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, to Ashland, Kentucky. A fellow named Frank Cox was the president of the enterprise. Wilder was never president, but Frank Cox was the president. And I see Bob Harvey back here somewhere. There's a great story about Frank Cox and his involvement in both sides of the war factions during the War of Yankee aggression. We can't tell that story here, but anyway, Frank Cox was one of the leading people who founded Asheville, North Carolina in the 1870s and 80s. He was the president of 3 Cs. An English banking company called Baring Brothers was the financing agent. And this railroad at that time was allegedly going to cost $21 million to build. And Baring Brothers advanced a good part of that money, and various communities along the route advanced other monies. So the construction got started. And in 1888, they had built 147 miles from Camden, South Carolina, to Rutherfordton, North Carolina, which is just south of Marion, North Carolina, basically at the foot of the mountains. And they had engineered trackage rights, the ability to operate on another railroad, on the South Carolina Railroad, from Camden to Charleston, which is 143 miles. And north of Rutherfordton, they had graded 200 miles of railroad. The only part of that railroad that ever operated was 14 miles from Dant, Virginia to St. Paul and a few miles south where they ran out of money. And 20 miles south from Johnson City to Unaka Springs, which is just beyond Irwin. And about 7 miles north of Johnson City to a place called Allison Mills, which is on Boone Lake, which people don't know it as Allison Mills now, but there's a bridge across the river there right where that was, and there was a sawmill. That's as far as they got. But now that and they went bankrupt in 1890. So all the money that was invested in the 3 Cs was in the ground, and there was no real return for anything. So what we have now is we've got perhaps the longest railroad grade that never had a train on it anywhere in the country. And I'll give you some examples. The company that was doing the construction work was called the Massachusetts and Southern Construction Company. And that 3 Cs affected the whole area. You know, why on earth would Unicoi, Tennessee, Main Street be called Massachusetts Avenue? Guess why? Okay. Now that Boone Lake has been pulled down, there's a fascinating site of the railroad, because the railroad grade. How many people know where Winged Deer Park is in Johnson City? Okay, the railroad came right through Winged Deer Park and got on the edge of the river, and it stayed on one side or the other of the river all the way to Eastman. And now that Boone Lake's been pulled down, you see that grade. There's a lot of stonework there, nice level situations. You come to a place where a creek comes in, there's nothing there, and it comes back up to the grade again. The city water plant pumping station is on the old 3 Cs grade, right through the tunnel beyond Eastman itself, as an example. Anybody know where K Cliff is? I know Bill Bryan does, because he had a wedding. K Cliff, the road to K Cliff is on the 3 Cs grade. If you look at it, it's nice level, it's got nice spiral curves, right there at the intersection of the Airport Parkway and 23. In fact, the grade came out right to that intersection. It missed it only about 50 feet. There's another road close by there called Lake Ridge Street. Anybody ever hear of Lake Ridge Street? About 12 feet wide, straight as an arrow, through the rock cuts and so forth, way up above the lake. More 3 Cs grade. Big Elm Road. Anybody know where Big Elm Road is? That's the first right off the bridge going to Hawkins County. You go a mile on that, you get on the 3 Cs grade. The railroad right beside the road in Weber City is the 3 Cs grade. It actually has a railroad on that. You can go all the way to St. Paul, Virginia with only a few 200-yard gaps in that grade. Nothing ever happened there, of course. Another place is Hemlock Park. When you drive into Hemlock Park, you drive right along the edge of the lake on a level grade, which is the old 3 Cs grade improved, and then it went through the gap. You kind of turn right into Hemlock Park, and the railroad went through the gap and crossed the river right there where Fort Patrick Henry Dam is, on a bridge that they'd never built. The bridge was never built, but they built a grade up both ends of it. In Weber City, you got Charleston Street, another peculiarity. Charleston, Cincinnati, Chicago. Anyway, the railroad went bankrupt officially in 1893, but they actually ran out of money in 1890. So at that time, they had about 5 or 6 pieces of this railroad. A piece in Kentucky, a piece in Virginia, a piece in Tennessee, big piece in South Carolina, North Carolina. And the bondholders began picking the parts of the corpse of what was there. And that lasted about 10 years. Meanwhile, a guy named, and that company was called, the Three Seas became the Ohio River and Charleston. And it was the Ohio River and Charleston of about 5 different states, of Kentucky, of Virginia, of Tennessee, of North Carolina, of South Carolina, because they broke it up that way. At the same time that the Ohio River and Charleston was struggling along, a fellow named George L. Carter showed up in Southwest Virginia, actually in Bristol. George L. Carter was really the father of Johnson City, Kingsport, and to a pretty significant extent Bristol as well. But he came here in the late 1890s for the coal business. Now, George L. Carter was born in 1857 in Carroll County, Virginia, which is where Hillsville is, if anybody's familiar with that area. And he was not a man of letters. He had about a seventh grade education. He started working in a general store there. And at the time he was working there, there was a lot of mineral activity in the Galax Freeze area for zinc and lead. And so he got to speculating in land and made a lot of money. He also made some pretty good political contacts that helped him. Money and politics kind of do this. So anyway, by 1897 or so, he was a pretty wealthy man. And he came to Bristol and formed the Virginia Iron, Coal, and Coke Company, which was basically Southwest Virginia. Toms Creek, Virginia, anybody knows where that is, was one of the centers. The area around Appalachia was part of that also. And as part of the VIC&C, they owned a railroad. It was a Virginia and Southwestern. It ran from St. Charles to Appalachia through Natural Tunnel, Gate City to Bristol. And he built another railroad called the Bristol, Elizabethton, and North Carolina that connected with that railroad in Bristol and went basically right down Volunteer Parkway toward Johnson City to Bluff City, across the river there, then went to Elizabethton, and then back up the valleys to Mountain City and Beuladine. And the reason that was important was two. One, it was heavily forested and really good timber. And two, there was a lot of iron ore in there. And Carter was making a play in the iron ore in the iron and steel business. Coal and iron ore and limestone were the 3 ingredients. So here he had a company, VIC&C, that used that. And here he had a railroad that connected them with all the stuff they needed. Now, Carter had a number of characteristics. He was kind of like an early day Howard Hughes. He had a photographic memory, and so he didn't require, personally, a lot of written documents. But the written documents he did have, he was very, very close with. And I'll give you an example of that in just a minute. Anyway, as I say, he was kind of like a Howard Hughes of the day. And he lived in Bristol. People in Bristol said that he had an office downtown in one of the business buildings, and he lived on Solar Street, which is about 6 blocks from downtown, and that he would walk through the alleys to avoid talking to anybody or seeing anybody or anybody even knowing who he was. He also dealt with the lawyers in abundance. One time they said he had so many lawyers on retainer that he couldn't find anybody to sue him, because somebody already had a vested interest in it. So anyway, he controlled the VIC&C, but the bankers who had loaned him the money decided he was not the right guy, so they forced VIC&C into receivership and forced him out. But Carter, and this was in 1900, Carter was such a shrewd businessman that he managed to get his own money out of the company. Everybody else took their, haircut, but he got his money out of the company, which was about $1 million. In 1902, remember, he's a really a close guy, and I'll give you this example. He owned the Bristol Herald Courier. And in 1916, he needed money pretty badly. And anybody here ever know Charlie Harkrater? He was eventually the owner of the Bristol Herald Courier, but he was the editor for years and years. Anyway, and this is a story he told me himself. He said he got a call from somebody, an intermediary, said that George L. Carter was interested in selling the Bristol Herald Courier. And Charlie said, well, I know a number of people who can help me buy it. And so he says, well, let's get together. So Carter set a meeting with Harkrater for 12 o'clock Saturday night in the Windsor Hotel in Johnson City. And he says, you bring what you need and I'll bring what I need. And they had already agreed on the price, and so they show up. Carter's got the minutes book for the paper and whatever financial statements there were, and Harkrater's got the money. And upon signing the papers, they had what they called a burn book settlement. They burned everything else in the fireplace of the room. So there was no record of the transaction except the fact that it was bought and sold on that day. Another example of Carter. Anyway, in 1902, he formed the South and Western Railway, right here. Now, Carter owned about 400,000 acres of mineral rights in southwest Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and southern West Virginia, which was virtually worthless because there was no transportation. So he formed the South and Western Railway, and the charter, another charter, the charter said he could build a railroad from anywhere on the Atlantic Ocean to anywhere on the Great Lakes. That's pretty flexible, isn't it? You can go through probably Alabama to get to there. Anyway, he then began to go back and buy up the pieces of ORC. And through the 1903, 4, 5, he bought all these disconnected pieces of the ORC and with the South and Western Railway and started extending it. And he started extending it south from Chestoa, Little Irvin, and got as far as Spruce Pine in 1904. And at that point, he realized he couldn't finance it. He had come as far as he could go with his ability to borrow money and his ability to put his own capital in it. So he went to, and here again, this is very uncharacteristic of Blair, he goes to New York. And he finds a private banking company called Blair and Company right here. And if there's anything about Kingsport that is a real mystery, Blair and Company is why Kingsport's here. Blair and Company was an amalgamation of the who's who of the early 20th century. For example, Thomas Fortune Ryan was one of the people. He was in the Rockefeller arena. He formed Consolidated Edison in Chicago as one of his many businesses. T. Jefferson Coolidge was a major coal mine operator in West Virginia and southern West Virginia and southwest Virginia. W.M. Ritter. Anybody ever hear of W.M. Ritter? W.M. Ritter was the leading hardwood lumber operator in the United States. W.M. Ritter eventually became Georgia Pacific. Anyway, these are the people who Blair and Company attracted. John B. Dennis was a partner in Blair and Company. So he convinces Blair and Company, James A. Blair, the manager of the company, and these other people to come down here and look at the great potential for the coal, for the timber, for the markets that they could reach in the Carolinas and at Charleston in the winter of 1904, probably in December. And there's a great picture of all of them lined up on horses at Toms Creek, Virginia. So they look over the property, they come back to Bristol, they have a banquet for these people before they get on the train to go back to New York. Carter didn't show up. He sent one of his attorneys to be the master of ceremonies, and he just didn't show up. That's just vintage Carter. Anyway, these people agreed to finance the South and Western Railway. And the South and Western Railway, from anywhere in the Atlantic Ocean to anywhere on the lakes, is the same as the CC&O. The CC&O, Carolina, Quinchfield, Ohio, was actually just the name change in March of 1908. But they hired a fellow named M.J. Caples, who was a mining engineer and a railroad location engineer, to design the S&W CC&O. And he designed a railroad across the mountains, 277 miles from Elkhorn City, Kentucky to Spartanburg, South Carolina, with a maximum grade against loads, coal going south, of 0.6%. Now, 0.6% in the railroad business is essentially flat. In fact, it's such a good railroad that if it wasn't for the curves, you could release a coal car in Dant, Virginia, and it would roll to Kingsport. But it was a spectacular piece of design. He built the railroad to what they call Cooper E60 specifications, which were way above the standards of the day. And they went back later and engineered, did studies that actually built it at E72. And to give you an example of how that works, we just built a bridge across the North Fork of the Holston River at Rollowood about 15 years ago. That's the fourth highway bridge we've had there. Fourth. Up the river 1 mile is the CC&O Bridge across the North Fork of the Holston River, built in 1908. The weight carrying that bridge is triple what it was when they built the bridge, and they've never done anything but paint it. And that hadn't happened in 25 years. But that shows you the kind of design that the railroad made. As a result, and I'm getting out of the 1925 limit here now, but the Carolina, Quinchfield, and Ohio Railway, i.e. Quinchfield, we'll get to that in a minute, was the most profitable railroad on a return of investment percentage in the United States most of the years from 1940 until it was fed into the CSX railroad. So it was a incredibly good business situation, not only for the railroad, but for making all that coal in Southwest Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, and some Southern West Virginia valuable. One of the many things that the CC&O did, how many people know where the Cooper River Bridge in Charleston is? Most people remember the old one there where you took a deep breath, hoped you got across it before you had to breathe. Anyway, right underneath that bridge is Drum Island. It's still there, and you can look going south, you can look off the bridge, see Drum Island right under it, and you can see a coal pier at the very end of the island. That was the CC&O Railway. That's where they exported coal. Now, bear in mind, in the 1910, 20, 30s, coal was the energy source of choice. You heated your house with it, you ran steamships with it, you sold it in South America, and that was part of the CC&O. To give you an example of how well the railroad was engineered, in addition to that bridge example, is almost 4% of the railroad was underground in tunnels. There were 55 tunnels in 277 miles. In fact, they took John B. Dennis over the railroad after it was finished, and they got out of Spartanburg, and somebody said to him, says, "Mr. Dennis, what do you think about it?" He says, "Well, I think it's going to be really fine when you finish covering it up." So anyway, the railroad was finished from Dant to Spartanburg in 1909. In fact, the actual last piece of the railroad in that section was right at Eastman, right through the tunnel, right under John B. Dennis. There's a bridge on the other side of the tunnel, and that was the bridge that finished that part. And then 6 years later, they finished 35 miles from Dant across Sandy Ridge to Elkhorn City, which is on the headwaters of one of the Ohio River tributaries. So that's how the railroad got there. And John B. Dennis was the person in Blair and Company that was designated to manage the railroad affairs and all the things that went with it. Now, Stepping back, in 1902, when George L. Carter was putting this Mississippi Railway together, he also bought 9,000 acres of land right here. It went from basically the Churchill city limits to Chestnut Ridge along the river, maybe a quarter of a mile in. It was not a regular piece of ground, but he bought 9,000 acres of land and went back to Carroll County and got James W. Dobbins to come down and run it. He incorporated as Kingsport Farms Incorporated. And so that's how the genesis of the land in central Kingsport happened. Going back to vetting, one of the things that most of us have heard if we've studied in Kingsport history is about John Nolan. John Nolan here, this was an architect, a city design architect. And John B. Dennis was with the superintendent of the Charleston, Carolina Railway on a trip to Port Royal, South Carolina to look at the harbor facilities, see if they wanted to consider building a coal dumper there instead of Charleston. And the superintendent's name was Anderson, and his daughter was on the business card with him. Her name was Lola. Anyway, John B. Dennis married Lola Anderson about 1913 or 14. And so she took a big hand in city design too. And John Nolan was hired from Cambridge, Massachusetts to design the city of Kingsport. That's the story, and that's what the Rotary Club sticks to. But the real fact is this, is in 1905, George L. Carter and a guy in Johnson City, who some of you might have known, D.R. Beeson, he was a civil engineer, he lived to be 103 or 4. He and George L. Carter laid out downtown Kingsport. George L. Carter says, okay, I want the depot to be right here. I want the main street to be 90 degrees off of this, Broad Street. I want it to be a circle, and the fan streets behind the circle. All that was laid out in 1905. If you don't believe it, go out to Wilson Worley at Meadowview, and the blueprint is on the wall. And D.R. Beeson was a great diary guy, and he tells a story about doing that, laying that out with Carter, and said that downtown Kingsport was the biggest briar patch in the history of the world, and it ruined a pair of blue Sears pants that cost him $4. Anyway, another characteristic of George L. Carter is he didn't want to do business, didn't want to be in a partnership with anybody. If he couldn't control it, own it, he didn't want to fool it. So in 1910, he decided he was going to pull up his stakes with the railroad and move to West Virginia, where he had extensive property at Coalwood and Coretta. But just before he did that, he got Johnson City on its feet because the state was considering building what they called a normal school in East Tennessee. And there were a whole lot of sites and a whole lot of competition for the normal school. And George L. Carter just up and said, okay, well, I'll give you the land for it and $100,000. Bingo, That's where East Tennessee State is. Isn't that strange? And his house was right there too, which eventually he gave to the university itself. So that was kind of his parting shot in Johnson City. But before that, he had financed and built the flour mill there, which is currently being torn down to be reworked to the Chamber of Commerce or something. I'm not sure how it is, but there's a big flour mill right off the main street of town, and that was one of his business, and he owned that flour mill right up to the time he died in 1936. And one of the strangest things about Carter and the flour mill is he put a guy in charge of it, whose last name was Ring, to run it, and then went off and did his other things for about 20 years. And suddenly, about 1930, he decides, well, let's see what's happening here. And he finds out that, in his view, that he was being, really taken to the cleaner. So there was a big lawsuit about it. And just the fact that there's a lawsuit, that's probably a third of the total body of knowledge about George L. Carter that exists. because it's a public record. So anyway, Carter goes off to West Virginia. He sells his railroad stock, gets completely disassociated. He was the president of the railroad until 1910, and makes a fortune in West Virginia. In this, I'll jump ahead a minute. Carter sold his West Virginia coal operations in 1925 to a major company. I can't remember the name of it offhand, but he took half the proceeds in money and half in debt. And he went broke in the Depression, and he got it all back. So then he turned it over to his son, Jimmy. And Jimmy sold it in 1944 for something like $80 million. In 1944, $80 million, a princely sum. So anyway, you know, Carter was not only a good businessman, but maybe he was lucky too. Okay, so John B. Dennis has got this railroad from Elkhorn City, Kentucky, nowhere, across the mountains, nothing in between as a consequence, to Spartanburg, South Carolina, which was something, but not wonderful. So he decides that they're going to develop the business that will consume coal and will generate traffic for the railroad. So the first thing they do is they find Kingsport Portland Cement Company, and they bring them down here from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania in 1910, and they built the cement plant. Guess who the biggest customer for the cement plant was? The railroad. They got these 55 tunnels that they needed to line with concrete. So that was the biggest contract the cement plant could have to start with. By the way, the cement plant also supplied the cement that went into Douglas Dam, into Cherokee Dam, into Boone Dam, into Port Patrick Henry Dam. You know, it's a damn big deal. Anyway, the Blair and Company people brought the Kingsport Portland Cement Company here. They then financed Kingsport Brick Company, which was the second business. Then they basically kind of operated like that with the core of Kingsport. In 1917, Kingsport was incorporated, but those were the two industries that had been here a few years. And then just before World War I started in 1917, all sorts of stuff came here. The Federal Dye Works and Chemical Company came here, which was the biggest employer in Kingsport. And that was a company that made aniline dyes because you couldn't get them from Germany because of the war. Let's see, the other company was American Wood Reduction, which was a company that was going to make methanol out of the destructive distillation of wood. And that's the genesis of Eastman. And then there was Edgewood Arsenal. How many of you ever heard of Edgewood Arsenal? Okay. How many people here remember when before Wilcox Drive was widened, if you're going south from the railroad, on the right, there was a great big round brick, what you might call silo, except it was a dome. Can you remember that? Anybody? Okay. That was the center of Edgewood Arsenal. And Edgewood Arsenal filled poison gas shells for the military. That's where the gas comes from. After the war, now bear in mind, Kingsport was incorporated in 1917. And the next 8 years, Kingsport, it was already booming, particularly the World War I stuff. And then we went through what they call a panic in 1920 and 21. And then the business came back up again. And the railroad was able to attract Corning Glass Company, which became AFG, the Borden Mills, great big cotton producer, Kingsport Press, and Blair and Company financed the Kingsport Press. The Kingsport Press had started during World War I, the building where the press was, to be a saddle and horse leather kind of business. Of course, that was untimely, as well as the fact that the war ended. So it sat there for a couple of years, and then Blair and Company financed the Kingsport Press. E.W. Palmer came and was the president of the Kingsport Press, and Kingsport Press became the largest book publisher in the world. At one time, this is kind of an interesting fact aside to me, at one time Kingsport had the highest postal receipts in the state of Tennessee, bigger than Memphis or Nashville, these places. And the reason was that they published the Book of the Month Club and they all went in the mail. And they shipped freight car loads of books out every day. Anyway, that's the quick and dirty genesis of how Kingsport got its industry. Now, see, let's go on down through here. Carolina Peninsula Highway Railway became in 1925. We're going to get to this in some detail, but in 1925, the Blair Company people leased, didn't sell, leased the railroad to the L&N Railroad and Atlantic Coastline Railroad. And they formed an unincorporated subsidiary called the Kingsport Railroad to run it. That was required by law by the Interstate Commerce Commission. And in 1882, just to jump way ahead, they sold out to the CSX, which is what we have here now today. Okay, let's go back over here. John B. Dennis, as I said, was the guy who was in charge of managing the railroad at Kingsport. In 1916, J. Fred Johnson was the president of one of the banks in the territory, and I can't tell you which one it was, but Carter, at the same time he sold the newspaper in Bristol, was trying to find money everywhere. And so one of the things he did is he had a number of banks. He owned a bank in Hillsville, Virginia. He owned one in Pulaski. He owned one I think in Johnson City, which is still the one the railroad uses. And so he would write checks and float them between his banks. You know, he was basically borrowing from himself, except the word assets just covered. And he and J. Fred Johnson came to a clash over that situation. And so Carter was relentless. If you ever really got crossed up with him, you were toast as far as he was concerned. So that's where J. Fred Johnson and Carter severed their relationship. And as far as I know, the only time Johnson was ever near Carter again was at his funeral in 1936. Anyway, John B. Dennis recognized J. Fred Johnson was somebody who could be a big help to him. So basically, J. Fred Johnson became Dennis's lieutenant for Kingsport. And very effective, I might add. Now, you know, in this day and age, if Alex president of a company and he decides he's going to retire, he gives the stock to his kids or he gives it to his employees or something, and the company goes on. Well, James A. Blair and company decided they were going to just dissolve the company. They weren't going to sell it. They weren't going to merge it. Blair decided he was going to retire, went down in the Caribbean, bought an island, built an estate on it. And so in 1923, they just started dissolving the holdings they had, which included the Kingsport Railroad, CC&O Railroad, and all the subsidiaries like the Holston Company, the Kingsport Farms, which they had bought from Carter one of the times that he was hard up for money. Holston Land Company owned Drum Island and Charleston, for example. Anyway, they were eliminating all those situations, and Dennis took those assets to manage. The government, because of the way the Kingsport operated, it connected with basically the main railroads in the South, and none of them wanted somebody else to have it. So the Interstate Commerce Commission, when they tried to sell it, said, "Not on your life. We're not going to let you sell that." So they turned around and found the Atlantic Coastline Railroad, which ran basically from Richmond to Tampa, and the Louisville and Nashville Railroad that ran basically from Cincinnati, Louisville, and St. Louis to Mobile and New Orleans. And the two of them agreed to lease the CC&O Railway. And the lease, how's this for Paul? The lease was for 999 years. Now, I'm going to give you an example of how the government gets you. The lease for 999 years started on January 1st, 1925. And They had $50 million of capitalization, and so the two companies that leased the CC&O Railway agreed to pay 3% dividend on the $50 million capitalization for 5 years, then 4% for 5 years, and then 5% for 989 years in gold. In gold. I mean, what a deal. Bear in mind that 5 years later, along comes the Depression, and interest rates were 1.5%, and here are these people taking 5% to the bank and buying up everything in sight. So that turned out to be a really good deal. But it was a good deal for the Blair Company folks and the people that had those securities. What was not a good deal was Kingsport, because with the dissolution of Blair and Company, with their interest in selling coal, hauling railroad freight on the railroad, they no longer sponsored Kingsport. They no longer financed the industries of Kingsport. They didn't have any interest in Kingsport. These two railroads were in the railroad business. They weren't in the land business. And since 1925, there's been not another industry of significance come to Kingsport, except Holston Ordnance. And the reason Holston Ordnance came was because of the unique chemistry that Eastman offered with the RDX program. So that's how Kingsport got its start. And that's the basis of the momentum that carried Kingsport through the Depression and a long period afterwards. Pearlie Wilcox came to Eastman in 1920 to manage the Eastman situation for George Eastman, and basically rescued Eastman because they had a tough financial time all through the 20s. So the bottom line is that's how Kingsport came to be, and we kind of operated on momentum after that. I was fortunate enough to ride the last regular passenger train into Kingsport on April the 30th, 1954. And there was a lady on the train named Mrs. Wallace Hufford, some of you may have known the family, who rode the first train into Kingsport 39 years earlier. You know, as I think about that now, you know, Kingsport's 100 years old, but all this is really, all of us here probably have lived half or 2/3 of that period right here in the community or know about it, and yet that's where we are. So that's how Kingsport came to be. Now, just one other point here. My timekeeper hadn't held her hand up yet, so I guess either her watch stopped or we're okay. But when you're building a town, when you're building a city, what do you need? Besides money, you always need money. Well, you need brick. You need cinder block, and cinder block was cinders from Eastman and the General Shale or Kingsport Brick Company made cinder block. You need glass. You need lumber. Guess what the biggest lumber company around here for 50 miles was? Eastman. Guess what one of their main products were in the 20s? Charcoal. Eastman allegedly developed the charquette. In fact, anybody here ever know J. Gillenwater? He was the I guess eventually vice president of purchasing at Eastman, but he's from Stone Acre, Virginia, and he went back to the very beginning of Eastman. And in the 30s, he was a salesman for Eastman, and he sold charcoal. And the two big markets for charcoal in those days wasn't for grilling steaks on the back burner. The two big markets were dining car stoves, where they cooked the food on a railroad train, and two was for refrigerated cars hauling produce from California east over the Sierra Nevadas in the wintertime. They put heaters in the ice bunkers to keep the cars warm so they wouldn't freeze. The tomatoes or whatever it was wouldn't freeze. So anyway, and there's one other story that Jay Gillenwater told me one time that I always thought was one of the best ideas I ever heard. He said when they started making charcoal, the plant was down where the research building is now, And they had this machine that would take sawdust and compress it into these charquettes, it's like you see now. And then they put them in a retort and fire them, and they come out, and if they put 2 tons of charquettes in there, they got a 2-ton lump. They couldn't keep them apart. So they had a fellow there who changed the light bulbs and swept up the place and went to town and got the mail back and forth. And so Jay said he was down there one day. He says, Frank, you got any idea what we can do about this charquette situation? He says, we got a big problem. He says, yeah, Mr. Jay, says, that's easy to fix. He said, well, why not? What do you do? He says, well, you just take those green charquettes out of the machine, and you lay them out on this concrete platform, and you take a sprinkler hose and just sprinkle them, get them wet, and then you just take a shovel and throw sawdust on them. You put them in that charquette retort, they won't stick together. They didn't. His example is there's a good idea somewhere all the time. Anyway, those are the things you need to build a city. The other thing that was insightful is it wasn't just random companies that they attracted here. They had the pulp mill, which became Mead Paper. Mead Paper started making paper instead of shipping pulp to another mill to make paper in 1923. Kingsport Press started production of books in 1923. So they bought their paper across the street. I don't know if they trucked it over there or put it over there in a wheelbarrow, but it was real handy. Eventually, Board Mills came here in 1925. By the way, Board Mills only built half their plant. The big building we all remember was only half the plant. There was supposed to be an identical building next to it, but the Depression got that. Anyway, Board Mills made the cloth that you use for hard book binding. Holliston Mills, another company that came here, made the cloth into material that you could use in a book binding, and Eastman supplied many of the chemicals that made it flexible and sticky and so forth. So you had an integrated situation, paper to a book, and the Book of the Month Club going out the door. So, I could go down a whole lot of these rabbit trails, but that writ large is how Kingsport came to be. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it, and it's vetted. And I'd be glad to answer any questions if Alex says I have time. Yes, sir.
When was the Coke actually produced? You said there was a Coke production early on. They used the coal to produce Coke, and the Coke then maybe was used.
Well, Virginia Iron, Coal, and Coke, as far as I know, Quinchfield Coal Company, which was the corporation that was parallel to the Quinchfield Railroad, I don't think they ever did coking, but Virginia Iron, Coal, and Coke made Coke. And in Stoneacre, Virginia, for example, I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's in a hollow and it's as crooked as a snake, and there were coke ovens a half a mile long there. And
Because the railroad would come alongside and loaded it.
they had a track across the top, and they would dump the coal in the top of the oven and seal it up and fire it, and then they'd pull it out on a track below it. There was a 3-step situation. You had the fueling, the coke oven, and the cars to take the coke out of it.
Tennessee has one of those in near Frozen Head Park. There's a big remains of the Coke facility there, and it runs along, and you just explained it, they needed it for the railroad. The reason they had it was longitude.
Making a link to Kingsport and General Shale. In 1932, Kingsport Brick Company and Johnson City Brick Company merged. Times were tough, and Kingsport Brick Company made a great product, but they couldn't sell squat. And Johnson City had a great sales force, but they couldn't make a brick. So they put the two together, and it's been a very successful company. Okay, thank you.
Ken, thank you, buddy.
You don't have a book, do you, Ken?
You want to show that book? Hey, Ken, thank you very much. This was very interesting. It will be interesting any time, but during the centennial year for Kingsport, it's especially interesting how we came to be. And so thank you, sir. Appreciate it very much.